Hello everyone, welcome back to Complete and Total Random. Today we're going to be going over tank classifications in War Thunder, what they mean and what they represent. So, there are 5 classes of tank in War Thunder. The light tank, medium tank, heavy tank, tank destroyer, and AA gun. These 5 classifications cover a wide variety of different types of vehicles that are all encompassed into each of these 5 categories. This is partially due to the fact that different countries had different classifications and different names for different styles of tanks and what they would do. Other than the AA guns, for the most part, all of these are very muddied and mixed up with other vehicles and different types of machines that had similar purposes, because there's not just tanks in War Thunder, there's also infantry fighting vehicles and all sorts of other types of vehicles, and that's what we'll go over today in this video. To start off with, we will go over the light tanks. These vehicles are a general purpose. The general description of these vehicles that I would kind of give them is usually quite lightly armored. On average firepower, they can sometimes be more, sometimes be less. A decent quantity of them, especially at the higher BRs, are quite fast, though at the lower BRs you'll find they're not nearly as fast. These vehicles, they encompass quite a few different kind of classifications of vehicles. These include things like infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, actual light tanks, things like the Puma, armored cars, and the like. But all of these do kind of follow the similar idea of how they act. Most of them are pretty good on their feet. You can get them around. They're usually pretty mobile. You can get to a lot of places. And they're designed more to just get their firepower into a place. They're usually really good at flanking with, and very poor at knife fighting with other tanks. They also have the ability to scout vehicles in realistic matches, which earns them more points and allows them to spawn in planes faster and makes it easier to spawn in planes. They're probably one of the broadest categories in the game, other than tank destroyers, which we will get to at the end. Next up, we have the medium tank classification. This is one of the smallest classifications in the game, other than SPAAs. This only really encompasses 2 types of vehicles. You have your medium tank, as well as your MBT. There's also some other small little classifications that you can kind of say, like the British had a lot of different classifications, like their cruiser tanks kind of fall into both medium and light categories. But for the most part, it's just kind of your medium tanks and your MBTs. These tanks are usually classified by their average mobility, average firepower, and average armor. These tanks are usually good all-rounders, not particularly the best armored, not particularly the best at anything. These tanks only get access to artillery. Light tanks also get access to artillery, but they also have access to their scouting. And other than that, there's not much to say on them. They're usually kind of a good thing to throw into your lineup. They don't really have many downsides, but they also don't really have too many positives. Yeah, they're kind of the most balanced vehicles in the game, I find. Usually the easiest to learn, because at least you have a little bit of armor that can potentially save yourself, a little bit of firepower, a little bit of mobility. Next up, we have our heavy tanks. This is my favorite classification in the game. Now, these vehicles don't get access to artillery, unlike every other vehicle in the game. They're the only vehicle that doesn't get access to artillery, but they have the main advantage of usually having extremely high firepower, good armor, and usually poor mobility. Sometimes they have good mobility, but usually it's on the poor end. The kind of categories of vehicles that you have in these, you got your infantry tanks, you have your kind of heavy tanks, you have your assault tanks, and your super heavy tanks. Now, each of these can usually play a little bit differently. Usually your more traditional heavy tank, kind of like the RL-44 here, pretty good firepower, pretty good armor, pretty poor mobility. Usually they're also very bulky, very large, which gives them some disadvantages. There's also your assault tanks. Usually these will have very poor firepower, but it's usually a trade-off for a lot more armor, like the Jumbo here. And then your more traditional heavy tanks. France doesn't really have them, other than maybe the Arl. And then some of them, just their firepower or will like kind of take them out of playing like a heavy tank. Things like the SPAA and the SPAA. Though their firepower will help them, they honestly play a bit more like the slower, heavier tank destroyers. And then, of course, you got your super heavy tanks. These are just massive behemoths of vehicles. Some of them have extremely large crews. And they have good armor for their time, usually. And then they're mainly classified by their extreme weight for their time period. So things like the Char 2Cs, the Maws, the Tog 2, these are all super heavy tanks because of their extreme weight. And their idea is basically, in real life, to put all their eggs in one basket. And then there is also the land battleship kind of style of heavy tank that we have with the good old T-35, where it's just a massive tank just purely defined by its weight. These don't really play like the other heavy tanks as they don't have armor, but kind of do as well because they do have a lot of crew, which gives them a bit of survivability. These are tanks like the T-35 and the Independent, the T-35 being way, way better than the Independent. And then next up, we have the SPAA. These vehicles kind of split into two categories. There's the category that's better at taking down aircraft, and there's the category that's better at taking down enemy tanks. Now, you might be surprised to learn that some of the AA guns in game are actually very good at hunting and killing other tanks. Things like the Duster is actually pretty good at killing enemy medium and light tanks, though it's not going to do anything to a heavy tank, as you may guess. Whereas things like the M16 is going to be very good at killing any plane that you see in the sky with a hail of bullets, but is going to be basically useless against any tank other than maybe a handful of light tanks. These vehicles do usually have some kind of unique features, such as a lot of later AA guns getting surface-to-air missiles, as well as having radar that they can lock onto air targets and use to help them aim in things like realistic matches. This is the simplest category of vehicles. Almost every single vehicle in this category was designed from the ground up to fight off aircraft. There's not much to really say about them. They're kind of a nice thing to throw into your line if you kind of want something as a backup to deal with air targets when needed. And then last but not least, we have the tank destroyer. Now, these vehicles, they kind of feel like, how do I put it? Gaijin's kind of backup plan for any vehicles that they can't put into the previous 4 groups. They'll kind of just shove into the tank destroyer group. You have things like the T-95, which is considered in its classification a super heavy tank by the Americans, but is classified as a tank destroyer, mainly just because it looks similar to to other tank destroyers, I guess. Kind of like the Ferdinand and other things, so I'm guessing that's why they put it in here. You have your actual tank destroyers, vehicles specifically designed for destroying tanks, things like the M36 and the LOSAT. And then you have things like your self-propelled guns, like the M109 here. Things like artillery guns and other things that aren't an actual tank. Things like the Sturm Tiger, which is designed for knocking down buildings, not knocking down tanks. And other vehicles kind of that similar vein end up getting kind of shoved into the tank destroyer category, which I find ends up making it so tank destroyers are kind of a little bit more muddied in their approach on how you use them. You'll use different ones differently, such as things like the T-95 and the Ferdinand. These things are kind of like your heavy tank destroyers, I'd say. Lots of armor, usually good guns, and just great at dealing whatever is directly in front of it. And the second something gets kind of around you, it's not as good. So these ones you kind of usually want to keep farther back. Use your big guns and big armor to your advantage, but the lack of turrets and stuff is a major disadvantage. Then we have things like the M36. These are also this is also a tank destroyer, like designed to be a tank destroyer. These are quite fast vehicles, usually designed for flanking and getting around enemy vehicles and up to enemy vehicles, being able to take them out and get out of there. There are some tank destroyers that aren't labeled as tank destroyers, even though that is what they were for in real life. Things like the M18 was specifically designed as a tank destroyer. These tanks are very potent. They almost act like light tanks in a way, but you don't get your scouting, so they kind of sit in a weird spot because of that. Then you have things like your derp guns, your howitzers and all those. These are kind of, I guess you could even say, another category, but I'd kind of fit them along with these other types of light tanks. These slower, less agile tank destroyers that kind of just suffer because of their a combination of firepower and armor, where it doesn't really matter what BR you put it at, it's basically going to perform the same until you get to really high echelons. It's also where you get your missile carriers, things which are also specifically designed to kill tanks, are in these BRs. These things usually in general just not very potent. They kind of sit in a weird spot. But all of them can be quite fun. They're usually the more wonky and interesting vehicles in the tank destroyer class because of this. And with that, I think that's basically it. If you guys have any questions about anything about these different classifications or anything, let me know in the comments below. And with that, I'd like to bid you all a good day. Thanks for watching.